Hi, I'm Nicole Ferraro, and this is The Divide, a podcast from Light Reading exploring the ongoing digital divide, why and where it still exists, and what needs to be done to get people everywhere connected to reliable, high-speed internet. Today, I'm joined by Ryan Polk and Steve Song from the Internet Society. We discuss how the Internet Society is tracking the resiliency of internet networks across the globe, and specifically how having resilient internet infrastructure is essential when it comes to recovering from ever more common subsea cable cutting incidents and preventing those cable cuts from leading to internet outages. All right. Ryan and Steve, welcome to the podcast. So nice to meet you both. It's great to have you on. I'm super excited to get to talk with you about subsea cables and the Internet Society and resilience efforts. But before we dive into all that fun stuff, I think it's both of your first appearances here on the podcast. So I want to give you both an opportunity to introduce yourselves and remind us what the Internet Society does and your individual roles. So Ryan, why don't we start with you, and then Steve, take it away.
I'm Ryan Polk. I'm a director of internet policy here at the Internet Society. The Internet Society, for folks who are not aware, is a global nonprofit organization that works to ensure an internet that's open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy for everybody. We're based all around the world, and we focus on things like improving technology standards, making sure that the policies that are being developed for the internet are good ones, and also working on education to make sure that folks have the skills to engage with the internet, and then also to build a more resilient and accessible internet. One of the things that I do at the Internet Society is I'm a co-lead on some of our measurement work, where we have something called the Internet Society Pulse website, which provides data-driven insights into how the internet's changing, with really a focus on the resiliency of the internet and how we can keep the internet growing and strong. And I'll pass it over to my colleague, Steve.
Thanks, Ryan. Hi, I'm Steve Song. I'm a Senior Director for Infrastructure Mapping and Development at the Internet Society. And my work is mostly focused on mapping the physical infrastructure of the internet, which we often don't talk about enough. We talk about the cloud, but we don't talk about the physical things that underpin it. And that includes fiber optic infrastructure, towers, radio spectrum, and things like that.
Excellent. Very important job that we know where all that stuff is, indeed. So we're going to be talking today, like I said, about resiliency and subsea cables. But, Ryan, you mentioned Pulse, which is part of the Internet Society, and I think that's where your resilience tracker sits. Is that right? So why don't you give us a bit of background on the Internet Society's resilience tracker before we dive into how that relates to some of these cable cutting events. How do you guys actually define internet resilience, and what metrics are you using to track it across the globe on your tracker?
Thanks for that. So internet resilience, the way that we see it, is really the internet's ability to withstand disruptions and maintain connectivity, even when you have things like cable cuts or other sorts of disruptions. We track internet resilience through our Internet Resilience Index, like you mentioned, and that looks at things, a whole bunch of different factors, about 30 different factors, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but it evaluates things like the availability and redundancy of physical infrastructure. So are there cables running to networks within the country and outside of the country? Things like upstream diversity, so meaning how many options do people who are connecting through networks in your country, how many options do those networks have to connect to the wider internet? So getting to the rest of the world. Also things like network diversity. So actually having a lot of different networks within a country can make it a lot more resilient, because if something goes wrong with one network, there's always more. And then another big thing that we look at is kind of the effectiveness of routing security, so that when there are disruptions or problems that happen on the internet, you can really route around them. And I think kind of going off of that, one thing to talk about with the internet and resilience is really what makes the internet special. So the internet is designed with local disruption in mind. It's designed for mess ups to happen. And rather than trying to build the perfect cables or the perfect most secure routes, instead the internet's all about building a lot of them. Um, the internet uses something called packet switching, which the way I think about it is it's like traveling with a car rather than traveling with a train. If you're trying to go from one city to another using a packet switching model, you get in your car, you see a sign that says, uh, let's say I'm going to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. is 100 miles away. Take this road, get on the highway, and go. Unlike a high speed train, cars can take any roads, whether they're highways, whether they're local roads, or even dirt roads. Some roads are better than others. Some roads go the right direction. Some might take you a long way to get to your destination. But all you have to do when you're driving a car is take an exit or make a turn in an intersection, and then you can take another road. So if you're driving from where I am in Virginia to Washington, D.C., and a bridge is closed, you can find another bridge, and that will take you closer to your destination. Packet switching on the internet is pretty much the same thing. Internet data is broken up and bundled into tiny little packets that are then sent across the internet to their destination. Each packet has the destination and the location of the sender written on it, kind of like a piece of mail, so that as it goes from network to network, it can be routed to its destination. So because of this, packets can take different routes, different paths across the internet to their destinations. And so that means that if a network's disrupted or something goes wrong, a packet can be rerouted, take another path, and find another bridge to get across the river to get to its destination. And so what's very cool when I think about internet resilience is the internet is hyper resilient on a mass scale. But at a very small scale, the internet breaks all the time. It's all about internet resilience is all about building for those disruptions and knowing that those disruptions are going to happen and making sure that you have the redundancy and the resiliency to be able to handle those sorts of disruptions. And so what we're trying to do is figure out ways of measuring that level of resiliency so that when bad things happen on the internet and you have the bridge go out, so to speak, you can route around it and everything goes okay.
So we're talking in this conversation specifically about one major issue that causes internet disruptions, which is subsea cable cutting. And a lot of times we see these in the news as saboteur type events, but often these happen accidentally and probably happen more often than people realize, thanks to internet resiliency and redundancy efforts. But let's just back up a little bit and talk about the cable cutting issue itself. How often do these incidents actually occur, and what are the typical causes? And can you name some? We cover these on Light Reading occasionally, but can you name some recent events that stick out?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So according to the ITU, there are over 200 undersea cable cuts per year, and the absolute vast majority of them are accidental or user error, fishing trawlers dragging cables that disrupt undersea infrastructure. And I think it's they would be more in the news if they were more disruptive. And I think we've noticed them particularly around the African continent, where there were two major interruptions, one on the west coast and the other on the east coast in 2024. And I think those are very. There's lots to learn from those cuts. So on the west coast in March of 2024, there was undersea seismic activity that took out four cables. The ACE cable, the SAT3 cable, the GLOW1 and MAY1 cables that were serving West Africa. And as it turned out, nobody really knew, but they were all following the exact, more or less the same path, the undersea path. And so they were all taken out at the same time, which was a huge disruption. As it turned out, a newer cable, the Equiano cable from Google, was following a different path, a kind of deeper sea path, and it was able to stay live. So this, I think, highlights a key point of resilience, which is route diversity, right? That it's not enough to have multiple cables, but they actually have to follow different paths. The other thing that I think nobody talks about, or not enough people talk about, is terrestrial infrastructure and the role of terrestrial fiber infrastructure in rerouting and restoring services. So terrestrial fiber through West Africa played a key role in the resolution of that interruption. And it's kind of like a peanut butter and chocolate issue, that you really have to talk about terrestrial and undersea together, because it's that makes up the resilience. And I mean, that brings me to the other interruption, which was on the East Coast in the Red Sea, where several cables were taken out. And this may have been an act of maliciousness, uh, in taking out those cables, but they turn out to be incredibly challenging to restore because of the danger of operating in that Red Sea area. And these cables are very, very shallow, and so relatively easy to disrupt, but quite difficult to repair. So again, it begs the question of, well, maybe terrestrial infrastructure is the answer here, and rerouting cables through Saudi Arabia and then maybe Jordan to the Mediterranean as an alternative. And I think the conversation demands that both kinds of infrastructure are discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me also of a debate we have here in the US about fiber versus fixed wireless versus satellite, when you guys are highlighting that we really need multiple layers of connectivity at all times, right? You mentioned, Steve, that there are about 200 of these incidents every year. So I want to go through each one that happened in 20. Just kidding. No. In terms of the typical outage, do we have a sense of how long a typical outage lasts? Or does it really depend on case by case in terms of the redundancy infrastructure that's set up?
I think there are a lot of variables in that. It depends where the break happens, right? The deeper the break is, the more challenging it can be to repair. Geopolitical issues such as the Red Sea can affect the ability to fix those cables. But also a huge issue is just the availability of cable ships, and that the demand dramatically outstrips the availability of these cable ships to respond quickly. And even for those building cables, you have to kind of book them years in advance for their availability. And many of these ships are getting older now, so there's a real need for more resources when it comes to cable ships.
Okay, interesting. So, what have you guys learned about how internet resiliency impacts if and how different regions can recover from these types of events? Do we have any specific examples too of how this has played out recently?
So I think one area where you have a lot of challenges with subsea cable breaks when they do happen are small island developing states, because in those countries they may only have one cable going to and from their country, and they might not also have terrestrial fiber as an option if they're a small island. One example of this is in Tonga in 2024, which there was a earthquake, that there's some seismic things that caused damage to their undersea cable that was going from Tonga, and the internet there went down for several months until it was fully restored. And there isn't another option of routing it somewhere else when you only have one cable. One thing that for small island developing states they can do is focus on local resiliency. So
Mhm.
how much of your internet can function if you lose that international connectivity? You might not be able to send messages across the world, but if you have things like internet exchange points, which I think of as kind of local roundabouts for internet traffic, it's an easy way to send internet traffic to and from multiple networks all at once within a country. And then also having data centers and uh, other local infrastructure that can provide some content or some capabilities even when that connection goes down. An example of this from probably about 10 years ago now, is there was an earthquake in Haiti, and a pretty devastating earthquake, and the undersea cables there were damaged. And if there were terrestrial fiber lines going into the Dominican Republic at the time, those were also damaged. Um, but they had an internet exchange point and local infrastructure set up in a way so that uh, the local internet could still function enough for first responders to be able to send messages to one another and for people to communicate and ask for help, using mobile signals to say, hey, I'm trapped somewhere. Can I get help here? And so having that sort of local resiliency is also really important, especially in places where having multiple connections to the outer internet, to the wider internet, is maybe not possible financially, or just a really big undertaking in terms of distances. Like if you think of a place like Tonga, that is pretty far away from many other parts of the world, and so the undersea cables to Tonga are going to be even longer than undersea cables to Haiti, like I was mentioning before.
Yeah. I think you guys have really illuminated why this is a digital divide issue, but I wanted to also give you an opportunity to speak to that notion. I mean, certainly it matters. Connectivity gets the most attention when it comes to the digital divide. We're connecting this many households and we're deploying fiber here and this there, but resiliency matters just as much. So I'd love to hear from you guys if you believe that people who care about the digital divide are also prioritizing resiliency, or what message you want to send to people about who care about the global digital divide about this issue.
Well, one thing I would say is it's important to recognize that fiber is, as an access technology, it's quite different from every other access technology. The capacity of undersea fiber optic cables, dwarfs anything else that we can think of, and it's constantly getting better. So when I first started mapping undersea cables around the African continent in 2009, a state-of-the-art cable was the CCOM cable, which was 1.2 terabits per second. Now, a brand new undersea cable can carry 300 terabits per second. It is absolutely, it's massive. It dwarfs any other kind of access technology, and that makes it fundamental to understanding. We need these undersea cables in the same way that we need the major arteries in our body, right? They are the super highways that carry everybody's traffic. And what makes them, the technology unique is that there's room for everybody. So from a kind of national strategic point of view, focusing on the spread of fiber optic backbones, both undersea and terrestrial, is absolutely key to seeing the healthy development of other service providers who depend on that to as their backhaul.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I'll add is that oftentimes the impact of internet resiliency is a lot bigger than you'd expect in terms of impacts on other systems within a country. And so one example of this is in 2022, there was the Kenyan national election. And Kenya was rolling out for the first time a election transparency system that relied on internet connectivity to local polling stations, and then a central hub that basically would be checking all of the transparency and electoral processes that were happening across the country, and then communicating that in real time to citizens who had access to the internet. This is really a game changer. This is a really big thing that happened there. And while this was happening, kind of the unthinkable happened. A cable started to have major problems in East Africa, and they lost international connectivity for a little bit on the day of the election. Now, like, my first thought would be, this is really bad for electoral transparency. All of their infrastructure is going to go down. How are you going to show that it's a free and fair election when your transparency hub goes down? That looks bad alone, whether or not there were other issues. But luckily, the way that the Kenyan internet infrastructure is set up on a local scale was that they have high resiliency locally within the country with internet exchange points for exchanging traffic. And then also the data centers that actually hosted all of this infrastructure for electoral transparency were located within Kenya. And so for Kenyans who were trying to see how the election was going and making sure it was a free and fair election, all of that infrastructure kept running, even when international connectivity went down. And so you had an infrastructure that could handle a disruption at an international scale with the undersea cable having problems. And as a result, you had an election that was a lot more clear. The transparency of the election was a lot more clear than it would have been. And this was an election where you had an opposition party come into power. And historically in Kenya, that has had challenges for democracy and in terms of just political violence. And this one was fairly transparent and didn't have as much political violence as ones previously. I don't know would that have been the case if the internet had gone down and for the whole country and the electoral transparency infrastructure gone down as well. And so when I think people think about resiliency, they need to be thinking about those other knock-on effects of what really does rely on the internet and like what systems in your country and services are tied to this infrastructure, because you need to have redundancy and resiliency so that these don't go down at the wrong moment.
Really, really well said. Fantastic example. Before I let you guys go, besides coming here and talking with me on a podcast that will go out to millions and billions of people, obviously, what is the Internet Society doing to advocate for necessary policy changes or best practices? And what are some best practices that you can recommend? Understanding, of course, this is a nuanced issue that might be region dependent, et cetera, et cetera.
I think more transparency is absolutely key. And I mean, there is a reasonable level of transparency around undersea cables, although there can definitely be more and more coordination. But when it comes to terrestrial fiber, it's actually very challenging to find adequate information and maps of terrestrial fiber infrastructure. Some operators are completely transparent, and others will share absolutely nothing. There are no norms in this space. And that's why the Internet Society has been working on an open data standard for describing terrestrial fiber optic cables as a complement to undersea cables to develop a real picture of the arteries of the internet. And we're working with regulators and operators around the world to encourage adoption of a common standard and a common level of sharing among operators.
Excellent. Anything to add, Ryan? Or
yeah, I think the other things to add are we're working with governments and policymakers and others on how ways that we can build the technical community in countries to make a more resilient internet. So we do trainings. We have training programs that we offer online and some that we do in countries in person with both policymakers and also with the technical community on internet resilience and the ways that you can make the internet more resilient where you are. Some of the biggest successes that we've seen over the years, places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which through building up their technical community and really working to grow that community, have gone from 3% of their country connected to the internet to now 27% connected over the course of about 11 years. Those are all really big success stories, but are success stories that really come from the local community doing the work and building up the infrastructure and building it where they know it needs to be to build that resilient infrastructure that becomes a more affordable infrastructure and a more accessible infrastructure. And I guess that's really the main thing, is that a more resilient infrastructure is also generally more affordable and also more accessible and brings more people online. And at the end of the day, that's what we care about the most at the Internet Society.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much for taking some time to talk with me about this. I really enjoyed it. And I appreciate the excellent, quiet work you guys are doing behind the scenes to help keep the internet running around the world. I hope you'll come back and chat with me again.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you again, Ryan and Steve, for joining me. Thank you as well to Pierre Landriau for editing this episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Light Reading Podcast for more episodes of The Divide, as well as interviews and insights from the Light Reading team. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.